All right, well, let me just pray, and then we'll just open up with just maybe some questions maybe you had from last week, a couple clarifications that I probably should have made last week and didn't, and then we'll jump into the topic for this week. We'll make sure we get out of here on time. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you again just for the opportunity to be here. I pray that tonight that as we look at a topic that maybe some of us are not familiar with, that it would challenge us. And yet that this isn't about the raft, as we looked at last week. This is about creation. And regardless of the position that your power is on display, pray that this wouldn't make anyone mad of maybe of some of their upbringings, of how they were taught or weren't taught, but it would just be something to expand their view of you and how little we know of you. And so I just pray that you'd be honored and glorified now. Just give us wisdom and clarity. And in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so any questions from last week that you had kind of a week to chew on some stuff? Anything that came up with young earth creationism that you were just chewing on? I was like, man, it'd be nice to talk about that a little bit more before we get to the fourth week. Anything at all? Okay, good. That's a good thing. And then one clarification I wanted to make was we were talking about fossils. It was really cool, kind of a very random God thing, if you will. On Tuesday, whatever. I don't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday. It doesn't matter. I had like a check-in with one of our part-time employees at Lowertown, who's our worship leader. He is also a full-time biology professor. And he does a couple credits at Northwestern University. He does about 8 credits over there with biology. And we got talking about this class in particular, and he was like, I literally just gave that exact lecture on different views of evolution and young Earth versus old Earth. He's like, but I taught it as a biology professor, and he's like, so it was kind of hard because I have to say, hey, it's Northwestern, it's Christian University. So he's like, I'm saying, hey, I'm a biologist, I'm not a theologian. And I was like, I literally have to caveat, I'm a theologian, not a scientist. So it was really cool. So they're all online, so he sent them to me, and I was able to watch them. Super helpful. And there was just a couple things that came up, and I was like, that's worth mentioning. And so I don't have his permission to share those lectures with you. But but I haven't asked him, so I will ask him, and I could probably share that with you. It's going to be a lot of this, more of the same, but it's just a PowerPoint and his voice over it. I just listened to it as I was driving around, but it was very helpful. So just coming from that perspective, he said a lot of the same things and some things that just in more depth. So it was good. So anyway, just want to let you know about that. But he did bring up different types of fossils. So when we think of a fossil, like a dinosaur fossil in a museum, I guess it's called like a body fossil, where there's sediment, it's rapidly buried, and the sediment happens, and then it calcifies right little by little. We talked about that. That's typically what we think of, but there's a lot of different types of fossils. And so I kind of knew that, but I didn't realize all the different processes. But the popular ones, though, are called trace. And that's like when you see dinosaur footprints, that's called a trace fossil. I didn't know that. I didn't know it had a name. I thought it was just a dinosaur footprint. I didn't know it was still a fossil. And then a cast one is where when something is buried, think of, not to get gruesome, but kind of what they did in Pompeii, that the body disintegrates and there's left a void, and they fill it, right? And because it's just this perfect mold of whatever was once there. And so that's also another way to look at different fossils and how long it takes for that to deteriorate, all that stuff. So just wanted to throw that out there. One other point of clarification that I did not mention, and I totally should, and I think I meant to, and I didn't, and that is, you don't have to be a Christian to be a young earth creationist, right? It's not like atheists versus Christians. There are non-believers who believe in a young earth, and obviously vice versa. So it's not just like, oh, the crazy Christians, they're all the young earthers. That's not true. I don't know of any names of anybody who is in that category, but there are scientists and people who are in that world who say, yeah, I'm a catastrophist. I can see how this would happen. My Zach Stelter, the professor, he was talking about there was like a video where they just showed water flowing laterally, and as it was flowing, depending on the size of the sediments, actually made perfect little layers. So even just with water moving, it could make layers and striations. And anyways, it was just fascinating. So not everyone who's a non-believer is just all of a sudden old earth. It's not necessarily the case. So that is that. Any questions on any of that stuff?
Do they typically belong to other like major world religions, or are they like?
Well, that's a good question.
Like non-theistic.
That's a good question. I have no idea, but I think that from what I remember reading, or hearing, I guess, was that the atheists are also young earth. They can't, there are those people. Okay. The people that I was reading that are like, oh, I'm a non-believer, or at least non-Christian, I don't know if it was specific to that. It's a good question, though. I don't know. Okay, well, let's get started with week 2. It's going to be kind of twofold tonight. We're going to be talking about theistic evolution, but then also what's called the literary framework view when it comes to interpreting the Genesis account. So in doing this is always the weird part of teaching this class. I'm now going to this is me now, okay? And if you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it as a theistic evolutionist. So, and I'm going to try my best to. If I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know. Google it. We'll figure it out together if we need to. But I will answer it as best I possibly can from here on out. And I'm going to teach this as if I believe this. Okay. So again, going back to Hope's statement of faith, this wouldn't really matter, right? If an elder had this position. We would probably have some conversations and want to know more about what's going on and some clarity, but this is not a deal breaker here, okay? So just putting that out there, all right? And I've not polled all the elders. So I have no idea what their view is and where they're at. It's not the raft. It's not something that comes up all that often, okay? So the biggest thing right now, starting this off, is you need to take everything you heard last week and throw it in the garbage can. Okay, that there is hardly any overlap between these two views. They couldn't be. You can be more polar opposite in the sense of I could be an atheist and an evolutionist, but that's not the case. So with this in particular, this view, it's going to be, the only thing that we're going to agree on from what we heard last week is that there is a God, right? This is theistic evolution. There is a God, and God sent his son to save sinners. Okay, this view still believes that and upholds that. There's no difference when it comes to that specific aspect, okay? So again, let's get into the sine qua nons. Anyone remember what sine qua non meant?
This without nothing or something like that?
Without which not. Close enough. Without which not. The sine qua nons for this, very similar. We're just going to do 1, 2, and then 3. And any guesses of what they might be compared to what they were last week?
The Earth is very old.
Yeah. Okay, age of the Earth. So last week we were talking about 6 to 20,000 years. Now we're talking 4.6 billion. It's just a little different, right? This is way different. So this might change a little bit depending on evolutionary theory and whatever, but that's the consensus. Is it's right around there, and we'll get into why that is tonight, where that number exactly comes from. Exactly, 4.6 billion. You know what I mean. Yep. Right. Okay, and then number 2. Any ideas? What might be up there with this?
Bible again.
Yeah, Bible again. Okay, except the Bible is not literal. exactly. So when we're interpreting the Bible, which again, we'll look at this, we're going to walk through the literary framework view of this. And then the third one, which is going to be pretty similar, is that we can trust science. That it has been proven over and over and over that these scientists are going to vastly disagree with even Rob Stadler last week and say, no, this is actually really good science, and we can prove this and test it and hypothesize with it over and over and over and get the same results. That's what science does. And so it might not be, I have to look backwards to it, all right? I got to test some rock samples. I can't replicate it. Well, of course I can't. There's a lot of things in science that you can't replicate that are still accepted because you can test it over and over and over again, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is look at arguments against creationism. That's the benefit of going second, is I get to attack that position where they didn't really get to do that. And so we're going to kind of just go through different aspects that would say there are other theories out there, even when reading the Bible, right? Because when you think about it, there's only two ways to go about any kind of process with this. You have faith and you have science. And so when we're reading the Genesis account, that can only get us so far, right? At least with the age of the earth. And again, the young earth people are going to say, oh yeah, well, see, look, just go through this, go through the genealogies, and bada bing, bada boom. That's great, but it can't prove the age of the earth. Science has to do that, and which they still tried to do, but I think they fell short. I'm going to do the same thing this week where I'm going to say, hey, let's look at faith. Is there holes in their arguments with the age of the earth and genealogies and all of that, and just how they're interpreting the scriptures? And then we'll get into, because that's not going to explain to us the age of the earth. Only science can do that. I'm going to say and argue that the Bible has nothing to say about the age of the earth. It's got nothing to say about it, but science sure does. And so we're going to look at that. Okay, so the first point within this view is that Genesis is not this reliable scientific bastion as some of these young earth creationists are going to propose. As we mentioned last week, just a couple in California or Answers in Genesis. They do good work, they're good people, they love Jesus, great, but they're not really good scientists when it comes to the date of the earth and when it comes to dinosaurs walking with human beings and the fossil record and fill in the blank. So let's jump into looking at some of the genealogies first and foremost. So when it comes to genealogies, do anything in particular stand out to you when it comes to the numbers? Just be Captain Obvious here. You don't need to, we're not reinventing the wheel. You don't need to be some, crazy, anything that just, I was reading it or I've read it. I always kind of found this fascinating. Anything?
People living over 800 years.
Yeah. Super old, right? Super old people when it comes to that, which we're going to get into in a minute. But another aspect that and this might be a minor thing, but last week they mentioned that there were 3 different studies that have been done within the genealogies that give you an exact day, right? Like, oh, it's on October 6th of whatever, 4000 BC. First off, I know that we talked about last week that there are gaps within these genealogies, but they're not meant to be specific because it'll say so-and-so was 930 years old. They're round numbers. It doesn't say they were 930 years old in 2 months and 2 days, right? Not every single person was born on their dad's birthday every single time, generation after generation after generation, right? And that's obvious, and I don't think anyone would argue that they are arguing that, right? Everyone was born in the same day. No one's arguing that. All I'm trying to say is that it's not meant to be precise. If it was going to be precise, it would be precise, and that's not the point of it. Okay, and so therefore we can't get to the exact age of the earth in that sense. Another aspect that a lot of biblical scholars are going to agree on this is that the patriarchs didn't live that long, and there was a reason for it. It was a literary thing that people would do to demonstrate someone's what do we call it? Like their they would embellish their story to say how important this figure was, right? The oldest figure that lived in the Bible, anyone know? Methuselah, do you know the date? How many? Yeah, 969 years, right? And so you have 969 years to say, wow, this guy, but he was a big deal, right? Look at what he did for all of our people in our community and who he was. And this was embellished, age of people was embellished in other cultures as well, to say this person lived 200 years, right? And they didn't live 200 years. We have proof of that they didn't live 200 years, but the history books say that simply to say this was a really important historical figure in that community. That's one aspect, the greatness of the patriarchs, if you will. And so it was fairly common in ancient history to exaggerate the age of people to highlight their greatness. Another aspect that's interesting is that some people will try to link the age of some of the patriarchs to astronomy. In that Enoch, for example, he is taken to heaven at a relatively young age compared to everyone else around him at 365 years, which is obviously significant. There are articles that I read that there are people who would argue that, right, because when you 365 days, that's a calendar year, that's what it took, and 365, what are the chances of that individual dying young at 365 or being taken by God at 365 days, which is exactly one calendar year? And then there were others that they would argue are the same time it takes other planets to travel around the sun. There's debate on that. Okay, so we cannot get to a young Earth just based on genealogies. There are other ways of interpreting old age and genealogies, which they'll admit that. But again, their admittance is then we'll stretch it to 20,000 years. They're not going into the millions and the billions, right? So now let's just look at Genesis and look at the account, and can it be taken literally? Should it be taken literally? And so we're going to look at some different aspects when it comes to this. Any questions about genealogies at all?
Yeah. So the people who are like, oh yeah, the Earth was created on October 6th, Thursday of 2008 BC.
Yeah.
How do they figure that if they're not assuming? Because I remember those genealogies. None of them say he lived to this number of years and this number of days.
Yeah. So what they do is there are other like extra biblical historical records that will say the date of when a certain king died, right?
Right.
So then they can get the exact date during the exile or whatever from Xerxes' death, and then they just can go back to some of that. So they get really specific, but you'd have to have a specific date for everybody. So I honestly don't know why they got so specific when like it was on this day, right? And especially when we use right now the Roman calendar, right? Which wasn't a thing back then. So it's hard to get into all that. All right, let's look at the Genesis account in particular. So, as a culture, we love things in nice, neat, chronological order, right? We watch movies that have a timeline. We watch football games, fill in the blank. We like things moving chronologically from left to right. It's just how we're wired. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or just a human thing. But we typically do that in that way, right? We go left to right. However, there are a lot of instances where things are organized by topic rather than chronology. Chronologically. I was trying to mash them both, and it wasn't coming out in my head, right? And this happens, right? Name a historical figure, or if you've read a biography about anybody, that happens a lot, right? They're not just, now there are chronological things and events that will happen of, hey, this person was born here, and let's watch their life as they get older, but there's also time, especially with any kind of political leader, of here's how they developed this view, and then here's how they implemented it. Here's how they, their relationship with this wife or whoever it is. And they do it in topics, right? It's a common thing that people use to get a point across. I'm actually currently working on a book where I am kind of going chronologically, but then when I bring up a point about it's on the history of fundamentalism, so I'm doing it kind of based through my lens and of someone walking through life and growing up in that circle. But then I get to a spot that something happened and I go back way before I was born to say, how did we get there? It's not in a perfect, always chronological way that we think, because it wouldn't work to write that way to get a certain point across. So that's one aspect. The thing is, this happens in our Bible all the time. This morning, I actually talked about this from the pulpit of looking at minor prophets and major prophets. Does anyone know the difference between a minor prophet and a major prophet?
Page numbers.
Yeah, right. Just the length of it, right? So our Bible is organized in an unchronological, sure, way. That it's not in a neat chronological order. I wish it were. In some respects, it would make it a little bit easier to kind of keep the prophets with the judges and all the different things that are happening, and the kings, and when is this happening. And there are Bibles, or at least versions, general versions, where some people do that. They take passages and do parallel passages or parallel people, and that's a really fascinating way to read the Bible because, again, my brain's wired that way. It helps me think that way, but that's one aspect. There's a biography about Nero that, first century Roman emperor, that breaks him down by, like, first half of the book is all the good things he did for Rome, and then the second half is all the bad things he did for Rome. It's obvious, but they're not talking, but they don't ever bring up dates. It's obviously not chronological. Like, they were perfect. Nero was perfect, and then he went off the deep end. Like, no, of course not. They're putting different things in categories that will help us interpret that. Now, this also happens in our Bible. When you think about the New Testament, just think about the Gospels. In particularly, if we just look at Luke and Matthew. When we look at Luke and Matthew, and this comes up quite often, of when I would say a position I would teach would be inerrancy of Scripture, and they go, but there's errors all over the place. Look at Matthew compared to Luke. They tell stories that happen at different times. Matthew puts this story before that story, and Luke puts it way at the end of the book. There's errors everywhere. It can't be true. And it's like, whoa, pump the brakes a little bit here, right? What is their agenda? Because if you look at Luke, he's going to take different moral discourses, right? He's going to take things like the Olivet discourse, or not Olivet discourse, he doesn't do that. He takes these kind of little teaches and little prophetic sayings, and Luke does it far more chronologically. But then Matthew, right, what's it called with this giant sermon of all the moral teachings of Jesus in Matthew? Sermon on the Mount. And then, so Matthew takes all the little snippets and puts it all in one sermon. Doesn't make Matthew a liar, doesn't make Jesus a liar. It's just arranged topically. And then you've got then the prophetic view. Does anyone know what that sermon was called? I actually mentioned it just a second ago. Yeah, Olivet Discourse, right? He was on the Mount of Olives, and it's the same thing. So Matthew takes a big chunk of all the prophetic stuff, big chunk of the prophetic stuff, whereas Luke is going to take all of those things and mix them up. One of the obvious ones that happens is the fig tree, when Jesus curses the fig tree, where in Luke he goes and sees this fig tree and he's like, I curse you, and then he goes into Jerusalem or whatever city he's in, and then he comes back out. And then the fig tree is withered. Whereas Matthew just is like, he cursed it and it withered. And it's like, oh, well, there's two different timelines. Did he leave town and then come back? Or it's like, yeah, the answer is yes. You know what I mean? Like it's not how it's arranged in that. This is not a contradiction. The story, the point of the story is exactly the same. So that's one way to think about that. Okay, so it's organized by topic. Even just within Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and morals and prophecy, the emphasis isn't necessarily chronological order, the way at least with it is with Luke. Okay, so is Genesis doing this? Okay, is Genesis going to do what's again called the literary framework? And let's walk through some of this. With the literary framework view. All right. Would someone mind if someone's got it available, open, ready? You got yours already open? You good? You there? All right. Just verses 1 and 2, if that's all right. Genesis 1. Oh, Genesis 1, yes. All right.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water.
Okay, so the earth, there's going to be two things here that are going to be mentioned. What are they? Two things about this earth. In the beginning, God creates heavens and earth was without form. Okay, so that's the first aspect, is you've got form, and then what's the second one?
Without form and void.
Void. Or what's another word for void? Empty. Okay, so these are two indicators here that the author here is trying to get us not in chronological, but into categories, right? Into thinking about this in literary terms of organizing what he's about to say into categories, okay? So it's not formed, it's without form, so not formed, I should say. Not formed, no form, and then it's empty, okay? So then when we get to these days of the weeks, what do we get, okay? And this isn't just like a modern day interpretation of this. This view has been around for a while. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s, the way he used a prettier way of saying it, he said days 1 through 3 are works of distinction, and days 4 through 6 are works of adornment. All right, so days 1 through 3 are going to be the form, and then 4, 5, 6 are going to be filling that form, okay? So what happens on day 1? What do we get? What's created on day 1? Light. Or separated from darkness. Okay? It's without form, it's void, and God says, let there be light, and there was light. Okay? So now he's filling the darkness, he's filling the void now with something, with light. He's giving it shape. Day 2, what happens on day 2? Water and sky. He separates the waters above from the waters below. Now, last week you heard a wild thing of this big canopy idea. Not every young creationist is gonna believe that. At one point, that was really popular view, but it's not so much popular anymore. But you got to put yourself in the shoes of Moses, if you will, and say, if you're an ancient reader and you don't fully understand how condensation and evaporation and accumulation of water droplets in the sky react to each other when they bump into each other, that somehow clouds can weigh billions of pounds and they float up in the sky. You don't understand that, right? But what do you have? You got this blue thing, you got water down here, and you've also got this big blue thing that's up there. And God is separating, he's forming this, he's separating the sky, the blue sky, from the waters below. Okay, that's the second day of forming. What's the third day? Land. Right, land from water. Right, he's separating it so that he goes light and dark, and then he goes water and sky, and then he goes land and water again. Makes the distinction there. Okay, so he's forming it. He's forming this world, and so now, after this day, it's no longer formless, right? Now we've got form. Now we got something we can work with, and then we get into days 4, 5, and 6, which day 4, what do we have?
Heavenly bodies.
Yep, right. I'll put sun and moon and stars, right? Okay, so now we're filling it. Now we're filling this. 4 is in correlation with 1, right? Seeing this? He's filling this. And then we get to 5, which is what? Fish and birds. Now we've got fish in the water and birds in the sky. And so 5 is going to correspond with day 2 as he fills this now formed place. 6, what do we get?
Animals, land animals, and
Yep.
Number 3 had plants as well.
Oh, 3 had, this one had plants, yeah. Thanks. No, I blanked on that one, right? So now you've got animals and mankind that's going to correspond with the filling of this, right? Eating the plants, doing all this, walking on the land, drinking the water. It's formed and then it's filled, and they correlate 1 to 1 with what was filled on which day it was formed. And I think that when you see it like this, you go, it seems like a literary device. It doesn't really seem like maybe it's a literal, straightforward, chronological reading. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe it's arranged in a topical order. And so the days could be a literary device organized by topic. I just said that. Okay, another aspect is humanity hasn't evolved in the sense that we've only been around for however many tens of thousands of years. The ancient writers that were writing this, they weren't morons. You know what I'm saying? We just have what's called the internet, which has probably made us a lot dumber. I don't know, are you old enough where you had like 1 million phone numbers memorized? Was anyone that old enough to do that?
How many is 1 million?
I mean like 1 million. I mean like the phone book. I mean it was like you had, and then just driving around. Because you didn't have GPS, so you had to know how to get everywhere. It was crazy how I knew every street in the city. I knew how to get anywhere. You couldn't just, you could Google it, and then you had to remember, all right, I got to turn right. What's that? There was MapQuest. There was indeed MapQuest. But even with that, you still gotta know this stuff, right? You gotta pay attention to street names and all that stuff. Now I don't know what the names of street names are. I just turn left when it tells me to turn left. They weren't morons, okay? And so we have, and someone brought it up. I think you brought it up last week, maybe I think, when it came to when we have, and so it was morning and evening, right? That's one aspect of well, how could you have a morning and evening if there is no sun and moon? How do you do that? Well, you can't. That's not the point of it. It's to be taken literally. Another aspect, again, comes to with the calendar of the sun and the moon. How can I base my calendar or a day off of something it's not there yet? How can you have a 24-hour day of something that's not there, that hasn't been created yet? And again, the plants being formed before the sun is formed. Because that's not the point. This is the point matched with these, right? That's the point. It's that it's a literary, so far we've just gotten to literary. We haven't gotten to the framework yet. That's going to blow your mind. Okay. And this is where it is, right? As a literary framework or literary device that fits into not just any framework, but a Hebrew framework. Because we have on day 7, which is often ignored a lot in this story, what happens on day 7? Yeah, God rests. All right. This is a 7-day week. Wild guess. Who do you think invented the 7-day week on their calendar? The Hebrews, right? So now you've got a literary device that fits in their 7-day framework, okay? That's one way to look at how to interpret the Genesis account. Pretty straightforward, nothing wild. Again, if you grew up in a camp that was like, no man, left to right, this word means this word. This can be like, wow, this kind of sounds blasphemous almost, right? And yet, when we sit and pause and just go, okay, but what's the point of it, right? And is the point of Genesis to describe the age of the earth? If the earth is young, sure, yes, it is made to do that. If the earth actually is young, then I have to read it chronologically. But, again, faith can only take us so far. And so, if faith can't take us far enough to describe and explain the age of the earth, then we need to look to science. And now this is when we get to science to explain a little bit more when it comes to the age of the earth. Okay, so before we get into that, any questions on this at all? Was this new to anybody, just by chance?
In what sense?
I just hadn't seen that or heard that or thought about that.
Kind of pairing them like that.
Yeah. Right.
I hadn't heard that.
Okay.
I'd heard of it generally, but not seen it explained specifically.
Yeah. Right, because and this isn't all like theistic evolution isn't always paired with literary framework per se, but it can be that because the only way I can believe in theistic evolution is if I believe in an old Earth, and this is one way to look at the Bible to say I don't think the point of Genesis account is the date, the age of the Earth, right? So that's that.
And then as you said like vegetation couldn't exist without the sun, and then also with like falling into that same argument, like light couldn't exist without the sun as well. Would we say that, or did he create the concept of light before he created light itself? Or
Oh yeah. I mean, well, light can exist without the sun, right? A match would do that, for example. But but yeah, so I mean, this though the light obviously is correlated with the sun, but to be literal with it, and I would, as a theistic evolution, I would still agree that the light here is going to be the light from God. He's making light, right? He is light, so he doesn't need a source of light to emit it, right? He is it. There's no darkness in him, right? So
sun is just the physical world version.
yeah, right.
Is that where night and day would come from for a young earther? Would be that like God turns off his light at night? What? how we have a day and night?
Oh, for morning and evening, you're saying? Well, yeah, that question came up last week, but what they would say is that because they know God creates time, right? He is the inventor of time. And so he knows what's about to happen. He knows what he's going to do. He knows what 24 hours are. And as a writer, it's morning and evening. Well, how do you get morning and evening without the sun, moon, and stars, right? So therefore, he had to have known it was what he was about to do, and it was the same time frame. That's what they would say.
It's Alaska, the solstice. Okay.
Correct.
For several thousand years.
So the question is, how does this compare to other creation myths of the day from Tiamat and all that?
Well-
they talk about separating the land and the sea and all that.
What did you call it?
From Tiamat and the different gods of the time.
Oh, so we will talk about that next week, if that worked. Because there are this is just one way to do this. As far as looking at Genesis, we'll look at another argument next week that we'll get into that specific aspect. Either next week, and if not next week, for sure the last week. I think actually, now that I say that out loud, it's the last week that we'll get into that. I think. I haven't written it yet, so we'll find out. I'll find out with you. No, I have a generally good idea of where I'm going to be going. Okay, let's get into then the science about it. Okay, when it comes to theistic evolution, it means what it sounds like, right? It means that there is. They believe in evolution. I believe in evolution, and that, and yet there is something that happened that's not just completely by chance. You throw the right ingredients into a specific place and time and pressure and fill in the blank, and then poof, out comes human beings. That a theistic evolution is to say, no, there is a God, and He creates, and He's really good at creating. But He uses the process of evolution to create. Is the simplest way of thinking about that, okay? And so what I'm going to argue is that life had to have a first uncaused cause. Had to have a first uncaused cause. And when you look at modern science, they're going to say, when you go to the Big Bang, when you go there, everything goes back to a singularity, right? And what was that singularity? What was that spark? Now, I've heard arguments against me in this point that, well, either just a pure atheist believing in evolution has to believe that matter itself is eternal, self-creating, fill in the blank, because it had to have come from something. And if it didn't come from something, if it's always existed, then the matter itself, the chemical makeup of whatever was in the Big Bang, created itself or was always existing, was eternal in itself. And then they would attack me and say, because I'm like, yeah, so that's where God comes in. That God created, like, yeah, but then he also had to be self-existing and all the different things. And it's like, yeah, but that to me makes a whole lot more sense to explain how we are here in this room having this conversation than chance, okay? Because modern science is even going to take telescopes, which I would agree with, look out into the vastness of space, and they can look at this and say, it's expanding, and it all came from a singular point, and go, yeah, that's great. And that first uncaused cause, that singularity is God, is a creator. He lights the spark. He's the light that goes into the darkness and says, we're going to do this thing. And so that's that aspect. And specifically, when this is where I would agree with the young Earth creationists last week, specifically when it comes to life, right? So it's not just that the start of this, like where did it come from? So the where and what, but especially when it comes to life itself. As was mentioned last week, that science cannot create life. And you can give it all the time you want. You can give it the proper aspects and chemicals and everything you want. It doesn't make life, and it never will, just with enough time and pressure, right? Unless you're, a big Jurassic Park nerd like me, and you're Jeff Goldblum, and you're going to say, what's the line?
Life finds a way.
Life will find a way, right? Life will find a way. That's not true all the time, right? But once life is created, and there's going to be disagreements on this theistic evolution might say, okay, well, life might have been created 4.6 billion years ago. The age of the universe is much older than that. This is just the age of the Earth, the 4.6 billion, right? The age of the universe, I mean, goodness, we're talking who knows how old, right? Trillions of years, for crying out loud. And so we talk about life, though, that God in his divine wisdom and sovereignty puts life on Earth. And it could have been a single-celled organism, and then he uses the process of evolution and gives it 4.6 billion years, and bada bing, here we are. And so that's how we get to theistic evolution. Any questions on that stuff?
I guess I have like an overarching question of just like within theistic evolution, there's going to be a lot of like subsections, right? Of like varying like categories and
Yeah.
like
Yeah, for sure. Because some are going to say, everything that you learned, depending on where you went to school, about evolution is true, and that God was just kind of a cosmic clockmaker, right? Just kind of, hey, I made it, I'm the first thing, and boom, here we go. And then enters into life when the first humans actually evolve from their Neanderthal. Again, not a scientist, so if you're like, you're wrong, that's not even, Neanderthals were from 100,000 years, I don't know, right? But at some point, there was a first human in the evolutionary process. And those first two humans found each other, and maybe there was a lot of them around, but Adam and Eve were the first two humans that would have found themselves, or humans, Homo sapiens, who would have had and reproduced together, right? So it's that same process of evolution. Right? Who was Neil deGrasse Tyson? He was asked what came first, the chicken or the egg, and his answer is, well, it has to be the egg, right? The egg had to have come, and then that hatched, and then boom, you've got your first actual chicken, right? In the evolutionary process, if that makes sense. And then they make eggs right? So that embryo is what mutated enough to become an actual chicken. And so it would be the same process with human beings. And God, in his divine sovereignty in eternity past, same thing that we read in our Bible, everything's the same. He knew that someday he was going to have a son, his son that was there with him in eternity past, that was going to take on flesh to save human beings, right? And they're unique and they're different. And so God is guiding that process, right? Which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But all right, yes.
So how do theistic evolutionists handle how death came into the world? Because if we're going by the fossil record, but saying that it's been billions of years, and the only way we can get fossils is with burial in these layers, you're going to have animals that have died already.
Mm-hmm.
So are we saying that death is separate from when sin came into the world, waiting all that time for Adam and Eve to sin?
Yeah. Well, no. So, and yes. So when you look at the process, evolution, everything happened. Animals came and went and died. Death is part of life. It's part of the evolutionary process, right? Selection of the fittest. That's the incorrect term. Is that right? Survival of the fittest. I was like selection of the fittest. That's not right. Maybe within theistic evolution it fits. I don't know. Right? And so that all happens. When you look at the Genesis account then of Adam and Eve, where sin enters the world, and then Satan says, "You're not going to die." Right? God didn't say you're going to die. I promise you, if you eat of the tree, you will not die. And they eat of the tree, and do they die? Yes. No, not right away. At least not for another 900 years. Right? So it's saying, well, what's the point of it? Death, physical death, has always been that's part of life. It's part of existing. But what happens to Adam and Eve, because they are different, they're the first humans in that sense, that they have souls in ways that these other creatures just didn't have. And so how do they die? They die spiritually. Now you have eternal damnation versus just a physical death, because we have souls created in the image of God. Does that make sense?
Are you going to talk more about, what is that, Genesis 2? Or Genesis 3, the fall?
I wasn't planning on it, but what's your question?
Like, well, you're the theistic evolutionist. Where does Adam and Eve, and especially like the apple, fall into play? Of like, okay, so you're saying that like a barely Neanderthal gave birth to a human,
Sure.
and then he happened to find the other one that was exactly like him. I don't know. Like, how does that work with a God creating man and woman, and like, well, how does sin enter the world then?
So
are they Neanderthals? Does anyone know?
I don't know. Whatever the step right before humans, so Homo sapiens were. I don't know.
Homo erectus.
Yeah, whatever that was, right?
Somewhere else.
So this is going to take not just Genesis 1, 2. This one's going to go 1 through 7, right? So this view is going to say Genesis chapter 1, actually even a lot more of it, but Genesis chapter 1 is 1 through 7 is all literary device. That this is all fairy tale, it's story, it's fable, written from a Hebrew perspective, and that's kind of gets into where Ben was talking about. Who are they? How is this story different from Hebrews' neighbors, the nation of the Israelites before they were the Israelites? How is their story different from their neighbors? And it's actually very, very similar, which we will look at that. Not today. So they're going to say, a theistic evolutionist is going to say, well, yeah, the apple is very, very metaphorical in the sense of it wasn't this physical thing. And yet that there is going to be some aspect of humans that are created in the image of God, that they sinned in general, and they chose to sin, but they were tempted, they were fill in the blank, and that's what happened. So it's not supposed to be a literal story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my understanding is there's some variation in it, whether it's chapters 1 through 7. And obviously, if they don't believe God does any miracles, then it's literary. But if they believe in miracles, He could also make a garden.
Yeah,
things like that.
There could be a lot of overlap back and forth. And again, this is why it's not the raft, because you could have a group of 50 theistic evolutionists and they talk about how they interpret Genesis 1 through 7, and they could all have a different way of how they read different verses. So, yeah.
And would somebody that only believes in microevolution, would still be a theistic evolutionist if they believe that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old?
No.
You
No.
have to do that.
Because this is going to be guiding. God might be the originator of life, but this is going to be macroevolution. This is for sure macro.
Okay. So then,
Not, I mean, it's also micro,
so then,
but this is going to be the speciation of.
so would that be a category that we won't go into?
We will next week.
Oh, that would be
Next week
What's
we'll
the title of that one?
historic creationism or gap theory.
Got it.
It has different names, but
Thank you.
Rachel wants to know, when do you get a soul? Like, according to this, like.
according to this,
Yeah, like which ones have souls and which ones don't?
well, humans do.
Yeah, but at what point are you
Where is
defining
it
them as a
here?
human? Because we're constantly arguing what's considered at what point are our ancestors ape-like ancestors versus human.
So, and this is where theistic evolutionists might disagree. Some are going to say, kind of what I talked about, the chicken and the egg. At some point, there's going to be a mutation that someone's going to become a human. Because think about it, if this is the evolutionary process, there's not just one set of Neanderthal parents, right? There are going to be tens of thousands of Neanderthal parents. And so the chances, and most likely as they're all evolving together, there's a branch off here and a branch off here, but these are both human, right? Adam and Eve in that sense. That they're the first actual humans that are born, created in that sense. Okay? Go ahead.
Even those 1 through 7, are they saying that Adam and Eve aren't necessarily like an actual person? They're just an example?
Literary.
Yeah, represent. Because and again, and we could get into it, but does anyone know what Adam means in Hebrew? Yeah, just Adam means man, right? So to say, oh, well, they're again using a literary device to say Adam, which is man, right? This first man, right? And it's like, well, okay. So now, when do they get souls? Apparently, when they were born in their mother's womb. Ooh, I got controversial real fast. In their mother's womb, they were given souls. Now, how does that all work out? That's a whole nother systematic theology class. But
Into like mitochondrial Eve. Or does anyone else heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
meaning,
There's reasonable scientific evidence that there is one woman,
oh, sure.
however many years
Originator of
old,
mitochondrial
who actually is
DNA.
the originator of all humans
Yeah.
alive today.
I got you. Yeah.
Like essentially all those other branches died out because they were missing like the natural selective.
Well, yeah. Well, and if you think about it, if these two end up having babies and you've got humans, they're going to be bigger, faster, stronger, smarter, fill in the blank than their predecessors. Natural selection. And so they're going to die off, or their kids are also human, right? And so that answers a lot of the big question that comes up with, well, who did Seth marry? He married his sister? Well, no, there were other humans that were also being born at the time, right?
How would a young creationist explain who Cain and Seth married?
It has to be a sister. It could be now a sister to.
Genetics back then are way more diverse.
It's just
It could be, but also it's if you've got 200 years removed, I would imagine it might change something,
Why not?
right? Sure.
Does those last tweets care or have an explanation for fossil evidence, grave evidence of human predecessors like the Lucy and Neanderthals? It's like bones.
Well, yeah, they would be based on that carbon-14 dating to say it's not that old.
Sure, but who are those? What are those things?
Well, and that's when you if I'm putting that hat on, I'm going to put Young Earth hat on, right? It's okay. That's all right. I gave you time to ask your question. That when you look at the skeletons and bones of different, they're always fragments, and then somehow they put it together to make this thing. It's just like dinosaurs. Remember if you read about this, the whole dinosaur craze, and they were finding because they wanted to be able to name it and then get the rights for it and get funding from a museum or whatever, and they were finding dinosaurs like crazy, right, in the 1850s, right? And then they got to name it, and then it was like, oh, you actually found like a thigh bone from one animal, and you crafted this whole thing. And it's wild. And that same thing is what happens a lot of times with these different skulls. And when you look at, still, there's modern skulls of people who die, people who are alive, that now with scientific processes and computers, you can do a head scan and go, oh, their skull is actually a lot different than the average skull. And still, right? And they're able to do blood tests, and they're still saying that, like they call it like the Neanderthal like brow that kind of hangs out a little bit, and it's like always the MMA fighters, the tough guys, like always have this, right, protecting their eyeballs, you know, or whatever. And so there's still, it's still part of the DNA, right? But it doesn't go back as old as what they're saying it is old as. And it can't. They're doing it based off of random little fragments because they can't date it to say, oh, it's actually older than 60,000 years. Can't do it. So, all right, that hat's off now. Okay, Theistic Evolution now.
I tried Googling this last week. I was like, no. Like the science behind some of this stuff, I was like, this is way beyond my comprehension level.
With the create young Earth stuff? Or this?
All of it.
Oh.
Like it started explaining rocks to me. I was like, okay.
Gotcha. All right, well, speaking of rocks, we're going to get into that now. You did. You asked about them. What time we got? We've been here for an hour-ish? Right. I made a Sean Connery joke this morning. Were you there this morning?
I was there.
Did you get it? My Sean Connery joke?
I was a little distracted.
I said the word tennish, like we're going to start at tennish, and the joke is, what does Sean Connery call Wimbledon?
Oh, yes, I read that.
Tennish. So every time I say like, oh, I'm going to be somewhere at 8-ish, or what I was thinking, oh, Sean Connery, tennish.
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay. Nobody laughed.
It's a thinker though.
It happens to me a lot. I don't premeditate my jokes. I just say what comes in my head, and people either laugh or they go, I don't get it, or that was terrible.
By the time they got it, they didn't want to laugh because they would have been embarrassed. Like, oh, then they're gonna know that it took me that long to
15
understand.
That's exactly right. Okay, so again, that was kind of the spiritual way, looking at maybe Genesis, age of the earth. Not going to find it in Genesis. It's not the point of it. So now let's look at proof that I think is quite compelling for the age of the earth being old, right? And that's going to be all of modern science. It's going to be the Darwinian theory of the age of the earth. It's going to be a lot of different things. I'm assuming most of you, if you did, grow up in public school, probably had a textbook that taught evolution, right? And so again, and that's always been the debate, right? You go back to Clarence Darrow and the monkey Scopes trial. Is anyone familiar with that? Where someone got fined for teaching evolution in a school in Texas. They lost that, but it wasn't. It was. But they absolutely destroyed the guy that was trying to defend creationism in court, and that's really when things took a turn to kind of like, wow, these Christians are morons when it comes to young Earth, and so things started to shift quite quickly and rapidly towards evolution to where now it's the opposite in a sense, where that. Schools only teach evolution, at least public schools will only teach that evolution, even though, and this was, whatever, I about hurt myself there with my talk. Okay, so let's get into, when we look at Darwin, again, he's going to date the age of the earth at 4.6 billion years old, looking at how long it would take. You looked at me crazy. Am I wrong?
I don't remember reading anything about Darwin trying to tell the age of the earth.
Oh, yeah.
I've never heard about it.
I'll actually walk through it. Okay, so I don't know the exact date, but he was basically, because I don't think he cared about the age of the earth. He cared about how long it took the organisms to get where they were.
The age of life.
Sorry, yes, the age of life. Yeah, which is going to coincide. What happened though was Darwin comes up with this number, in particular, of how did we get to these species that we now have. And it was in the billions. I think it was 4 billion years old. And no geologist or biologist was anywhere close to that, right? And so it was like, wow, we've got some work to do to play catch up, if you will. So there was a guy by the name of Sam Keen, and he got this bright idea by drinking tea, and his spoon, metal spoon, was in the hot tea, and he took a little sip and it got hot, kind of burned his mouth, and he was like, oh, I'll just leave the spoon out and let it cool off, and then I'll be able to use it. And then he had this idea, wow, I bet we could figure out the age of the Earth based on how fast rocks cool. If you take a molten rock or anything molten and you leave it out in the atmosphere, how fast does it radiate heat? You can then do that on a small scale, do it on a massive, scale it up, and we can measure how fast is the Earth losing heat to the vacuum of space. He didn't know how to do that. He wasn't a scientist. Maybe he was to some extent, but he didn't know how to do that. Well, then a guy comes around by the name of Lord Kelvin, where we get our Kelvin units. I forget his first name, or I didn't write it down at least. And he's able to do it. He's able to do the math, do the science on it, and he says, hey, he's a leading scientist, brilliant mind, mathematician, and he says, I've figured it out. Here's the rate at which the Earth is expelling heat into space. And Kelvin says, the age of the Earth is 20 million years old. Right now, that was old. That was like, hey, we're a step in the right direction. I don't know if we'd be categorized as young Earth anymore, but we're for sure nowhere near where Darwin was talking about, right? And so he writes all these books about it, and nothing ever comes of it. They're like, hey, cool, Earth is 20 million years old, but we're still contradicting each other when it comes to science. So then another guy comes around, and his name is Rutherford, okay? And he's a brilliant mathematician. I guess he was pretty quirky, said a lot of weird things, cussed a lot, all this stuff. And I guess he would just run around singing Onward Christian Soldier, like in his lab when he was working on stuff, which weird. They said he had a walrus mustache, which I don't know what that, but I can picture it. You know what I mean? I know what that would describe. So it seems like a pretty eccentric dude. Anyways, he comes up with he kind of figures it out, and he says, well, we can date and figure out how old rocks are based on radiometric dating. And we can look at the decay rate of elements and figure out the age of the Earth based on different elements that are decaying. And so there are a lot of different elements that decay. Last week, we looked at carbon-14 decaying into carbon-12, right, where it loses the 2 and becomes nitrogen. Again, that half-life meaning, and I threw out that random number of 100, but if it's 1,000, after 6,000 years, it's going to be halved. After another 6,000 years, it's going to be 3/4. So the number of the atoms doesn't really matter. It's always the half-life remains the same until it gets to a 0 or no detectable traces, which in carbon-14 ends up to be 60,000 years. That's true. No one's debating that. That has been proven over and over and over again. However, what they fail to mention is that there are other elements that decay, and yet you can radiometric date that have a much, much longer half-life over 6,000 years. So Rutherford figures this out. There's potassium that decays into argon. There's uranium that degrades into lead. But the one that he was most interested in was uranium, which, I don't know, the periodic table, I remember in chemistry, like in high school, having to memorize it. Does everyone ever memorize that at some point? And I remember so uranium, anyone know the symbol for uranium? It's just U. It's just U. Okay. And then uranium, and I'll put a 92 here, which you probably remember, maybe you don't. Uranium, though, can decay into thorium. Anyone know the periodic symbol for thorium? Just TH. It's just TH. Why not? Okay. And this is 90. Does anyone remember what these little numbers mean?
It's protons and neutrons.
or electrons.
Yeah. Okay. So depending on the protons, and this is how many protons it has within it, and that's what gives it the number that it has. So this loses 2 protons. So the decay that pops out of this is called a mother and a daughter. I don't know. Yeah, this is called a mother and a daughter for whatever reason. I don't know what this one's called. stepson. I don't. I'm kidding. That's not true. That's not true. Not a scientist. But this though has the number 2. Does anyone remember what number helium? Okay. Does anyone know the He? Look at that. I know. Isn't that wild? It's wild, isn't it? And so that's what happens. So the 2 breaks off into that. Now, helium is very interesting. It's the second one in the periodic table, all this stuff, whatever, great. Helium, though, is what's called a noble gas. Does anyone know what noble gas means?
It fills all the spaces in its electron shell. So it's on like the far right of the periodic table.
Very stable.
And so
it doesn't
it
tend to
can't.
react.
Yes, okay, exactly. Okay, and the best illustration I heard of this, it's a noble gas, just like the noblemen of old didn't want to interact with common people. And I was like, oh, is that why they were called noblemen? Like, I guess I never really thought about that. I don't know if that's true or not, but you've got the helium then, that's a noble gas that does not want to interact with any other elements, like anything. It just will not combine, and it's very rare. So the number is, in atoms, there are 5 helium atoms per 1 million. And so if you do the math, it's 0.0005% of the air is helium. So it's not a super, right? Do you remember a couple years ago we had like a helium shortage, right? Well, this is why, right? There's not a lot of it around, right? It's a process to get it out of the air. And so you have this helium then. Now, because it's a noble gas, it doesn't like interacting with other elements. Now, you're Rutherford. This hasn't been figured out yet. You know this. This has been, everyone knows this. But you're trying to figure out the age of the Earth. How does this help us figure out the age of the Earth? Any ideas?
Like how much, so we can measure how much helium there is.
Yep.
And that'll tell us how much uranium changed into helium.
Yes, okay, it would do that, but how do we figure out what the helium that's in the air versus helium that's in the rocks? How could we figure that out?
Like basically the percentage in the air versus the percentage in the rocks and
Well,
comparing them.
there's air in the rocks.
Right.
So you're comparing that air with the
Well, yes and no, but the whole aspect, what comes from it is the idea of the noble gas, right? It doesn't want to combine, it doesn't want to attach itself to anything. So how could there be helium in a rock when it's being formed?
It'd have to be trapped.
It'd have to be trapped, right? So in the idea here that he comes and figures out, and he says, hey, there's no chance. There's no way helium would just be like, hey, I'm going to go hang out with these other elements and just hang out with them in the same rock and attach myself to it. He's like, it doesn't work that way. It would never work that way. But what would happen is if uranium was in a rock formation and then it started to decay and then it produced helium, and we can measure how much helium is in that rock, and we know its half-life, and then we can determine, we know the half-life of uranium, and based on how much helium is in there, we can determine how old this rock is. Ta-da! Now, what was interesting, there was a debate between Kelvin, who's saying the Earth is 20 million years old. He's arguing the Earth is 500 million years old, right? So now we're going, now we're easily within a factor of 10. We're not that far off from Darwin now at this point, right? Scientists are, but he's the young guy. He was 33, Kelvin was 80, and they had this debate, but he quotes Kelvin, and he quotes Kelvin himself, and he says, when Kelvin says, the calculations about the age of the Earth are correct unless, about the 20 million years old, about the radiating the heat, unless someone discovers an extra force to generate heat in the Earth. So something's got to be keeping the Earth hot. And what would produce heat in this process? How do we get steam from what's the word I'm looking for? From reactors? From
Yeah, the Earth is a big nuclear reactor.
the Earth is a huge nuclear reactor, right? And when you look at how do we get steam, right? We take the radiation and we produce steam with it, and we get the heat, and yada yada yada. And so that's how he's able to say it's not anywhere near 20 million years old, because we can look at how much heat comes from the decay do the math, and he gets 500 million. Other more scientists come out later on because now they've been testing this over and over, and they actually then get to 2 billion years old, and now we're in the grand scheme of things extremely close, right? So that is how, in one way. There's a lot of other ways, and again, when we look at just the stars in general, and you look at the Webb space, there's a new telescope I just learned about that is making like a map of the skies. Anyone heard of this thing? And it takes like it's way faster, I guess, than the James Webb telescope. Because again, talking about what we looked at last week, that when you look at something that's that far away, you're seeing it as if it was, if I'm looking at a star 12,000 light years away, I'm looking at it 12,000 years old. That star could have been burned out for 12,000 years and we wouldn't know about it, right? But when you look at it, it's like a time machine. And so they're now mapping the sky. And so they can look at just how long it takes a star to form or a star to die and do the math, and they go, it's got to be billions and trillions, if not years old, when it comes to the age of just the universe, let alone our Earth. And then they can calculate, how did we get our moon? And I forget, does anyone know the name of like the hypothetical rock, or there was like another body, that rock body that crashed into Earth, and then the leftovers formed the moon.
I don't know the name of that theory, but
They had a name, whatever that thing was, because you had Earth that was an Earth. It was just a molten, it was forming, it was young, and it shatters into that, and the molten aspect forms and coagulates with itself within its own, and then so people are able to do that science and math and go, oh yeah, that's how old our moon would be compared to. And so they would argue that the moon and the Earth are the same age because they were formed at the same time. That's one theory, though. Okay.
An object called Theia.
Theia?
Theia.
Yeah. Okay. It sounds familiar. It sounds familiar. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts on that? Okay. Great. Okay, so you take proof of an old Earth, mash it together with a literary framework view, and boom, you have a faith in the God of the Bible who doesn't contradict modern science. And again, that's just one view. We'll look at another one next week that's still going to hold to old Earth at that sense. However, when we look at this aspect of evolution, and all the science to show macroevolution that's been proven and all this stuff with geology, but it cannot prove, and this what evolution, atheistic evolution cannot prove, is the idea of time plus chance. It can't do it. You keep doing it and you keep trying to do it, and to make life, especially the origin of life. You can do this with speciation, and you can do this with the age of the Earth, but the origin of species, like genuinely where did we come from, this doesn't make sense. There's an idea that's called when something is irreducibly complex, that you can't take any part away from it, of the thing, and still have it work. And that is true with any living organism to be true. On a cellular level, on an atomic level, that when you take a little thing away to get it to work, and so anytime you get this mutation, there's got to be some deity, in a sense, some theistic person, God, who's guiding this whole process to say, hey, we're still going to give it time and chance, but I am really going to help this along. And we're going to take a lot of the chance out of this because I'm going to help this process along.
What'd you call that? Impossible?
Irreducibly complex, right? And so just think of an engine, of a car engine, right? Not every part of it would be irreducibly complex, but when you look at like the cell, like a human cell, and you just get into it, all the different like machines that are in a cell to get it to do what it's got to do, you take one of those little, unbelievably microscopic aspects of a single cell out, and it ceases to exist. The chance to get all of that working together at the same time is impossible. It is just impossible. And so this answers, I think, a lot of a lot of problems that evolution has to say, yeah, but what if there was a God who was helping and guiding this process along the whole time? It takes away the time plus chance of the odds of so many things coming out to be perfect alignment every time. It's impossible. I mean, it is mind-boggling when you start adding up the chances of everything that comes into play when you're dealing with any kind of organism. Well, just one single cell, right? All of our scientists have never been able to create a living cell. Can't do it. Can't do it. So
And that's where, like, an atheist would argue that they just, if you have enough time.
have enough time. Yep, you get enough of the parts and the chemicals in there, and you give enough time. After a while, eventually it will. Now they would still say it's a statistical anomaly, right? Because we're the only species, intelligent life that we know of in the universe, right? And how is that? You can look at the trillions of galaxies, let alone like there's a thing I almost thought about showing it to you guys. But I didn't know how to show a TikTok in here, so I didn't do it. But and I've shown them to my kids because it's mind-boggling. And what he does is it's kind of weird. He's kind of got a creepy voice, but he's in this like space suit, and it's 3D animated, and he talks about the universe. Anyone ever stumbled across these things before? If I find it again, I'll maybe see if I can figure out how to show it. But what he does is he says he shows the universe and the size of it. He goes, okay, if we were to expand whatever, and make it to so many Titanics long or whatever, and put it in a sphere, you have this giant sphere, how spread out these galaxies would be. And he says it's kind of hard to understand the vastness of this. So he goes and he says, let's turn every galaxy into a piece of cereal, right? And he says, okay, now I'm going to start filling an Olympic-sized pool with galaxies. Right, and he goes and shows, like, fills the Olympic-sized pool, and you can't. That number is just staggering, right? And and just at that point, you're like, that's crazy that there would be that many galaxies. He goes, okay, now imagine there's 350 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled with galaxies the size of a Cheerio. That is the unit, and it's just like, what? So the chance that there's no life out there, maybe there is. That's a whole nother conversation. As a pastor, we could talk about, but anyways, just getting into the time plus chance. I'll just say this: I believe in intelligent life other than humans because I believe in angels. I believe in other beings that are intelligent that were created by God. Now, did God send His only Son to die for angels and fallen angels? No. So if there is some kind of intelligent life form out there that has fallen prey to sin, but angels haven't, so there's something else maybe that's out in work in the cosmos. If I find out tomorrow we're being attacked by aliens, it doesn't put my faith into question at all. Like, I wouldn't be surprised, you know what I mean? Like yeah, it checks out with the rest of the Bible that there's intelligent life out there. Anyways.
Wait, did Jesus die for them then?
No, they're not human.
Maybe.
Maybe they have
We don't know their
alien
story.
Jesus, but we don't know that.
John 10:16, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold.
No, that's out of context. That's good though. That's good. I've not heard that before. Okay, all right. So that is, and now again, this is not that God is some kind of clock winder, right? That God was the first uncaused cause, and they just said, all right, I'm out. I'm just gonna. That's not what's happening here. Theistic evolution is going to be a little bit more involved in that. It's definitely a part of it, but that's not very theistic. That's just trying to answer. That's like Prometheus or whatever. Like it's actually called panspermia is the language that people use of, well, we don't have any explanation where humans came from, so we'll say that we were all of the History Channel now, right? We came from aliens and a greater, more intelligent species that put us here. They started us, and it's like, yeah, that doesn't answer the questions, though, right? It just defers it then to a different species, but it's a thing. So, right, what was the Crystal Skull in Indiana Jones? And it's an amazing top 5 movie of my lifetime. Why are you laughing? I'm just joking. Yeah. Okay. Any other last thoughts, questions? Go ahead.
Going back to the literary framework, is there anything to like like, is the writing style of the first couple chapters of Genesis different than the rest of Genesis that would kind of support that? Like, that's how I've heard it explained before, but I don't know Hebrew to know.
Well, so yes and no. So yeah, depending on who is teaching the class, maybe that's a different class. 4 views on how to interpret Genesis, but yeah. So there are what's called like the Q theory, or like it's ACD, not ACDC. It's not that, but there's different authors based on the language and just the age of certain manuscripts we have, wrote different portions of it. That is a theory, but it's also highly, highly debated and not widely accepted. At least it's not unanimously accepted. It is widely accepted, but it's yeah. So
1 through 7 was by a different author, or at least written in a different
yeah,
form or
right,
style or
right.
whatever.
Yep. It's a theory for sure. Yep. We most likely might get into that next week. So I have this is wild. I have like a Generation 1 iPad. So from when I started seminary, I had to buy a bunch of books, and Kindle was like a new thing, and so I had the Kindle app on this iPad, and I download. I bought thousands of books on this thinking Kindle or this iPad, but my login info got shut down. It's right. My login info got shut out, and so I can't get into Kindle. Like I can't log into Kindle on any other app or anything else other than this iPad. And it is like my most cherished possession. I've tried everything. I've tried so many things to try to get into that Kindle, and I can't do it because they send you go check your email. It's like I can't get into that email. It doesn't exist anymore, right? Because it was a university email or something, and it's like I can't get into it. So how can I? Exactly. So I can't get into it other than this one Kindle that has remained signed in on my iPad. And in seminary took a class specifically on the book of Genesis, and so I have all these awesome books on my Kindle, or not on my Kindle, on my iPad. Anyways, that had nothing to do with anything, but yeah, hopefully we'll get into that a little bit more next week. So
what I kind of just thought of is, why do you think they reference Adam and things in, I guess, Genesis 1 through 7 so seldom in the Old Testament, or is it pretty often that they?
As far as bring up the historical figure of Adam?
Yeah.
It happens enough, enough to, Jesus talks about Adam.
In the Old Testament. So I know Peter and Paul and people talk more about him and Enoch.
Yeah, the New Testament does quite a bit. Jesus does. I'd have to think about if the Old Testament writers do that. If they do, it's not really the Old Testament is always looking forward to the Messiah, right? There are, again, lineages and the genealogies that do, like a random just name drop, but they're not going to necessarily talk historically and theologically about Adam.
Right. They're not making arguments from
No.
the past. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are there, just thinking of theistic evolution, is there different views on within theistic evolution of God's, call it starting point, like did God cause the Big Bang, or is the idea somewhere further down the road than?
I think that that within that viewpoint, it's going to be whatever science has shown to be accurate, then they're going to go, yeah, okay, that's where I'm at. So because they're going to argue the Bible doesn't talk about this at all, other than there is a causality and there is a singular point of where everything comes from, right? That everything comes from God. And this is, when we talk about God, well, I'll get into it next week. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So, yeah.
It's just like anything else where people can jump on and off when they want. They're like, oh, well, God, yeah. It's different points.
Mm-hmm.
I think my favorite argument I ever heard from the theistic evolution was, I just want the earth to be old.
Yeah, right. And so I just and the reason for it is because again, young Earth creationism seems like a laughing stock in that sense, in a lot of aspects of like, oh, you're just a Bible thumper, fill in the blank, you know. And whereas, if I am a theistic evolutionist, then when I read a magazine or I go to a museum or whatever, I can go, yeah, see, I agree with that. That's all true. This is Pastor Brian now talking. This is what Tim Keller called, did I bring this up? What he calls a defeater belief? I don't think I brought this up. He called like something like this when it comes to creation and the origin of life, a defeater belief. Meaning there are people who will say, I could never believe in Jesus because you think that the earth is young or that we didn't evolve from apes. And so therefore I'm not going to believe in Jesus. Keller would say, he didn't ever use my raft analogy. That would have been pretty sweet. Get the royalties, can't Tim? No, I didn't know. And so, but to say it's not the raft. Why did I even bring that up? Sorry, my brain connected it and then I lost it. Oh, the defeater belief. Thank you. Someone can believe in evolution completely, that we evolved from apes, and believe in Jesus for the forgiveness of their sins. Those are not, and so if someone's like, I can't believe in Jesus because you don't believe we evolved from monkeys, I would say, you believe whatever you want about what we evolved from. I want you to put your faith in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. And then we can talk about where we came from, right? And there's a lot of those defeater beliefs of people who say, I can't do that because this. And it could just be the history of the church, right? Church hurt or pain and go, oh man, I could never do that because this happened to me. It's like, yeah, that's the church. That's not Jesus, right? And there's a lot of beliefs like that people will elevate to the raft when it's not. Anyways. Think of it as, like anything, right? I became a believer when I was a kid. I was 7 years old. When I put my faith in Jesus, had my dad said and asked me, he led me to Jesus when I was a little kid, if he would have said, Brian, what's your view on the Trinity? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, it's 3 in 1. Well, is Jesus fully God, fully man? I'm like, well, that doesn't, even in my 7-year-old brain, that doesn't make sense. No, I can't explain that. Well, guess you're going to hell. It didn't count. No, of course not, right? Like, it doesn't work that way, right? So there are things that just aren't the gospel that we make gospel. Now, I would argue the Trinity is the raft in the sense that once you explain the Trinity to somebody and they say, well, I don't believe in the Trinity, well, you're not on the Christian raft. You're on a different boat. You know what I mean? That's a different conversation. So, awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, next week we will look at historic creationism, and that'll be kind of the last week of looking at one of the major views. That one is going to be far more heavy on the faith side, interpretation of Genesis. And we'll talk a little bit about science, but not so much because there's so much overlap between the other views that there's not going to be a whole lot of time for that or need for it. And then the last week, again, we'll just kind of recap and then really get into what was the point of Genesis, and that's when we'll do the why was it written kind of aspect. So.
Is that name of that one like gap theory? Is that kind of like a hybrid model between the two, or is that not what's getting at? Like filling the gap between. No.
It's just saying that there's a gap in the days and in the language, but yeah, no, it's not that. So. All right, well, thanks for coming, everyone, and we'll see you next week.